Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm with my great friend, Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi everybody, this is Chen, your old friend. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. I'm also based in Austin, Texas, and great to be with you today.
Great. So, as we discussed in the last episode, we have introduced a new direction for the Versucha, and that direction revolves around the concept of human nature. Now, what we told you, we talked about extensively about all the reasons we have to pursue human nature um, in more depth. And one of the main things that we mentioned was that the human nature seems to be an axiom, seems to be used as an axiom by philosophers, theologians, historians, anthropologists, natural scientists, and so on and so forth, right? And we think the proper study of human nature hasn't happened, or if it has happened, the communication between different interesting studies of human nature hasn't been made. And we're interested in that kind of creating a community space to speak of human nature and explore its connection with theoretical and practical aspects of human life. Now, we should begin, but the question is, where should we begin? And a part of this is very arbitrary in the sense that we could have started elsewhere, but we have decided to start from human nature as a concept and its relationship with evolutionary biology. And this means that we're going to talk about mostly philosophers of biology that are interested in the concept of human nature in the light of the changes in our biological knowledge in the past 2 centuries. Now, the why of this is pretty simple because what the pattern that we have noticed, especially in the history of philosophy, is the fact that human nature has been understood as something fixed or something given. Of course, change has been understood as part of humanity, but the concepts of human nature, if not always, most of the time, have been have been reduced to some form of a fixed identity. This could be rational. It could be violent. Like it could be like sexually, um, interested, self-interested, something like that. Um, and all these kind of conceptions of humanity, um, positive, negative, descriptive, prescriptive, whatever they are, they seem to share this kind of a very fixed core understanding of humanity. Now, what is interesting about evolutionary biology and what evolutionary biology does to us and the rest of nature is that it really just puts everything in a chaotic field, right? Everything is susceptible to change, everything is up for grab, nothing was always there, and everything that has ever been could disappear. Like it's a very odd um, discipline when the question of human nature is posed to it. Like if you read evolutionary biology and then suddenly ask human nature, it seems like there is like a very kind of a important dissonance happening. It seems like human nature as usually understood has nothing to do with evolutionary biology, or evolutionary biology is there to just kind of debunk everything we have assumed about human nature, and that's going to be the position of some of the people we're going to talk about, but not all of them. And that is interesting for us. How could there be some sort of a compatibility between human nature and evolutionary biology? And we also are interested in the methodological concerns that may arise in studying human nature, whether human nature is a natural scientific object, and what does that even mean, given the fact that we are human beings and we are doing the investigation. We are not necessarily investigating something external to ourselves. We're studying ourselves and how um, natural scientific method could contribute or fail to contribute to that type of a study. Here's for the introduction. Trent, do you have anything to add here?
Yes, I think I like what you just said. I just want to give listeners a clearer picture why I personally ascended to do this philosophy of a biology project with you is two reasons. First is we talked about that in like several episodes ago. There's a common denominator approach common to a lot of sort of scientific or humanistic thinking, and one very intuitive feeling to do human nature is to see what it belongs to a human being's life, like life is biology. So to clarify the relationship between human and a non-human life form is really seems to me really important because there are important cultural or religious positions which would challenge such like human non-human boundaries, and why does this matter for us? Second point is the evolutionary model is really interesting in the sense it gives a lot of weight to history, time, and change, that what happened in the past that would influence the future, but does not necessarily decide the future. And on the other hand, it also kind of contrasts any type of essentialistic claim about something being rigid and not changing. And therefore, this model has been borrowed across biology into many disciplines really close to my heart, like cultural history. We're talking about a cultural evolution nowadays, and we will definitely read on that topic in the future. And also in sociology, like a certain, like a Nicholas Luhmann's theory of like a communication of foundation of the society is essentially is directly influenced by evolution of biology. So I think this is sort of very, as you mentioned, a very good starting point. Is not the starting point, but I think it definitely satisfies both our interests and hopefully also address our listeners' interest somehow.
Yes. And in conducting this layer of studying, pursuing this layer, we have read a short book by Grant Ramsey called Human Nature. And Grant Ramsey is a contemporary philosopher of biology. And there are a couple of reasons why we picked this book. Number one, it's a very good survey of a lot of different approaches to the question of human nature from an evolutionary biology perspective. Now, we're going to have disagreements in the way that Grant Ramsey represents some of these approaches, but in terms of like enumerating them, we have a lot of like we cover a lot of land in a very brief kind of condensed way. And also, Ramsey has a solution where Ramsey is claiming that he has a model to understand human nature that is compatible with evolution biology. So we can deal with not just a survey, but also a claim, and building from that, we can move on. Now, what Ramsey does at the very beginning of the book is to kind of tell us what he's doing here and what he's not doing. And in some ways, I think what Ramsey is doing and what kind of like delineation he is bringing about is also applicable to a lot of other philosophers and thinkers who approach human nature from evolutionary biology. Um, when we study human nature, we can think about philosophical anthropology, right? About the conceptual frameworks in terms of which we think about uh, Homo sapiens, right? More specifically as a social and cultural animal. Right? And so it's a study of the conceptual frameworks of understanding humanity. We can think about like theories of human nature. It could be not just about anthropology, but it could be like, Buddhism, how Buddhism understands human nature, how Confucianism understands human nature, how feminists understand human nature, so on and so forth. Meaning that this could be like, everyone could have an understanding of human nature. Every tradition could have an understanding of human nature. And we can just go study those, right? But this is not Ramsey's project, and this is not necessarily an evolutionary biologist or a philosopher of biology interested in human nature's project. Um, Ramsey writes that the focus is simply on what we mean, what we should mean by human nature within a contemporary scientific worldview, right? And we keep our criticism that we have about every aspect of Ramsey's position to later episodes. But for now, we just like want you to kind of see this, right? So the focus is simply on what we mean by human nature within a contemporary scientific worldview, right? Something is being excluded, and it's not still clear what is being excluded because, the way that Ramsey situates this feels like that he wants to say that, I'm not just going to enumerate how many things people have thought about human nature, right? But in doing so, he introduces this whole idea that this is within a contemporary scientific worldview, and things are going to become more clear of what he means by that as we move on. Before we do so, though, Trent, do you have any points so far?
Yes, I think it's fair to insert an explanatory note here on the way Graham Ramsey foregrounds kind of has the intellectual integrity and the transparency as on the founding uh, principle he appeals to not engage with other inquiries about human nature or the term that comes up in other discussion is they are irrelevant to him because he means what he says here. We are examining in this book what we mean by human nature within a contemporary scientific worldview. Therefore, like theories of human nature and philosophical anthropology do not, those approaches are irrelevant here. Of course, we'll talk about the problem in the critique episode. I just want to make that clear. This is not unique to him, but is in fact the default way for a scholar to narrow down one's approach in a by nature open-ended inquiry. With that said, we can just move on.
Yes. And in this inquiry, something that interesting that I think happens that this one I think is more about a Ramsey move than any like a broader understanding of evolutionary biology and its relationship with human nature is how Ramsey deals with the problem of speciation, right? Basically, the problem of how do we create the boundaries between a species, right? Now, Ramsey definitely mentions, some points about that. That, when we're thinking about, different species, like when we're thinking about, okay, what can determine the beginning of a new hornless rhino species? Um, the point there is that if you're trying to find a founding member of a species, what we're looking for is like the branch in the tree of life, right? If, an entity starts a new branch in the tree of life, and not just because it has morphological difference for in this its ancestors, then we have a new species, right? So, for instance, you can have a lot of new species that are morphologically very much the same as their ancestors, but they haven't started a branch in the tree of life.
Mm.
That's why they aren't part of new species. But of course, this is a very broad, general way of thinking about speciation because what constitutes starting a branch versus not starting a branch, right? Like what is that's a very important problem and a problem that is very contested. Philosophers and biologists the same. There is no consensus on this idea of speciation. But interestingly enough, for Ramsey, the problem is that problem seems to kind of like he simply shrugs at that problem. And the reasoning he has for that is that he says that in the case of Homo sapiens, our problem is not identification but characterization, right? Meaning that we have no problem of like putting like a human being and like randomly, toss a coin and based on that, like choose an animal that put together right side by side a human being. And, like, old film noirs, like someone, investigators come in just like see who matches the murderer, right? We have no problem with identifying a human being amongst like apes and like walruses and like, whales. Like it's not that we are going to get confused right? What we get confused is that what characterizes the entity that we can simply identify, right? So for Ramsey, speciation is not a problem because the problem is not identification. We already know what a human being is. We can just point at it. We know what a human being is in that sense. We don't know what it consists of in a way. We don't have like a morphological issue to deal with, like, differentiate human being from other entities. If we were interested in, this specific, butterfly's nature, then that would have been a different story because identification amongst, like, for instance, like beetles or insects is going to be much more complicated than mammals, right? But for Ramsey, identification is not a problem. Therefore, speciation is not much of a problem. So we can just go and, you know, assuming that we can easily identify a human being, move on to characterize it. And that's going to be very important when we get to the criticism that we have of Ramsey. Before moving on, though, Trent.
Yes, similar to the previous slide, I think it is fair to insert an explanatory note, but not our critique here, that Ramsey's identification approach is not difficult for him. It's based on the current moment, because if we are like talking about human beings or human ancestors, or 5 million years ago, there were different groups of hominids, and he maintained in the text itself that it will be a different question. It will be way more challenging to identify members of a specific Homo sapiens species. But the second paragraph, he's using Darwin's tree of life, which is essentially about the evolution and of the species wherein time is baked. So here we see speciation is at the same time used as historical process and also as the how to put it, contemporary circumstances that we find ourselves in. So I'm just pointing that out, and we should.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point. And something that I wanted to also make it clear, like the problem with speciation, like the reason we talked about problem with speciation is that that's the kind of like a first obstacle that we have to, approach human nature from an evolutionary perspective, because species are not fixed. Species move, species change, species are keen in weird ways that Aristotle could have never dreamed of, right? Like that's going to be a problem. But for Ramsey, that's not a problem. But the second thing is a problem for Ramsey, but he thinks he has a solution for it. And that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the book. And that this is the question of human essence, right? Um, to put it very broadly and to allow us for a very massive mischaracterization, probably of many philosophers, we can think about a pre-Darwinian conception of human nature, any pre-Darwinian conception of nature, as an essentialist approach, right? How applicable this assumption is to everyone involved in West and East and North and South, how applicable this is to history of Western philosophy, that's debatable. But I think in general, like as a broad stroke, the idea is the thing that I mentioned at the beginning. The idea of something that is being fixed, right? It seems like that Ramsey and others that he mentioned in this book, some others that he mentions in this book, think of essence as something that is fixed and that is something that is kind of like given and there. And because of that, there are many people in the history of philosophy of biology, post-Darwinian history of philosophy of biology, that do not want anything to do with human nature because they think human nature equals human essence. And one of the main people there is David Hall. David Hall famously created this argument that Ramsey reiterates in his book to say why doesn't make any sense to talk about human nature. It's very easy because the human species has no essence. That's the first premise, which is just saying that there is nothing absolutely fixed about humanity, which from an evolutionary perspective is absolutely true, right? Um, Natures are essences, and therefore human species has no nature. Now, a couple of points here to kind of get into the rhythm of like what Ramsey is setting up for us. Number one is this conception of essence, right? That essence is something that is fixed. Uh, that is clearly not as of a consensus as Hall is thinking. I know even like, famous Islamic philosophers like Mullah Sadra that has a very interesting point about substantial motion and like change at a level that may include a change of essences. So definitely this is not a ubiquitous assumption, although it's a very powerful one historically speaking. Okay, so thinking of essence as something fixed is one way to go it, and that's what Hall is thinking when he's thinking about essence. It's also interesting to think about people like Griffiths that Ramsey mentions that they are post-Darwinian essentialists. So that just I think it's important to mention that just to remember that just because Darwin showed up, that doesn't mean that everyone who is aware of that, someone who's not denying evolutionary biology, cannot have an essentialist position. It very much depends on that their conception of essence. For Hall, essence means it's kind of a fixed trait, fixed core. And I think Ramsey also assumes that. Ramsey doesn't think human beings have any essence. I think for the same reason Hall doesn't think human beings have any essence. But he disagrees with Hall that natures are essence. Therefore, Ramsey thinks that human species can have nature without having essence, right? And that sets up the kind of like the plane of thought that Ramsey thinks could flourish with these set of assumptions, right? That human beings have no essences. Evolutionary biology tells us that. Um, but essences are not natures because there are other ways to think about natures. And here's how we can think about nature, the options. And he unfolds what these options have been in the history of um, biology and history of philosophy of biology. Before moving on to this kind of broad view of the options at hand, Trent, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you did a really good job. All I want to say perhaps is so on a broader theme of human nature, Graham Ramsey comes into, but he places his accent on the second term, nature, because a human is like is so transparent. We all recognize, but nature is interesting. Is it essence? No, it's not essence. So what are the possibilities? So lead us there.
I think that's a very important point. That, yeah, the point about accent, definitely the accent in uh, Ramsey is on nature. Like he's far more curious about what nature is than what human is, in terms of like the identity issue that we raised in the previous slide. Now, for Ramsey, there are broadly speaking two ways to understand human nature without human essence. And this without human essence basically is without some sort of a fixed set of things that is just God granted abilities and traits and capacities. Broadly speaking, they're categorized into two different groups, the trait bin account and the trait cluster account. Now, one thing that we want you to kind of like kind of recognize here because it's gonna come up in our discussion about this whole approach is the concept of trait, right? So we're thinking about human nature without human essence with a language of trait. So that's what is shared in these two groups. And you might wonder what a trait is, and we wonder with you, because that's going to be an issue that we're going to have with all of this. But more of that later on. From the trait being account, we have two options. Um, One is focused on a statistical frequency of traits, and the other is about evolutionary property of traits. The trait cluster account, Ramsey mentions a couple of options, but we've decided to just put one here that is his approach and mention the rest in the criticism of Ramsey. And that is what we have given the name causally sustained patterns of trait sets. We're going to unpack that shortly. But let's first think about the trait bean account. As the name suggests, the trait bean account is kind of thinking about maybe a list, maybe like a, a bin that the natural things for humanity are thrown in that bin, and there's a non-natural thing that, the stuff that are not part of the core of humanity are thrown into that one, right? There's a very kind of like maybe a rigid distinction, although the traits might change in some ways. Now, the first approach there is statistical frequency of traits, as the name suggests, thinks about human nature as like, how frequent a trait exists within humanity, right? The more frequent it is, the more we can say it belongs to human nature. Of course, this can accommodate change because human beings change. And, that means that this is not essential in the, you know, maybe pseudo-Aristotelian way, but it is something that is like there is a bin for it, right? There's something that we can put these things, and the way that we kind of like choose the bin of human nature versus non-human nature is a statistical presence as opposed to a statistical frequency of certain traits. That's a statistical frequency account. Evolutionary property account focuses on um, the origin of a trait, right? So for an evolutionary property approach, we are concerned with discerning where one trait comes from. And the main distinction we want to make is to see whether something is just culturally crafted or simply given through evolution. And very broadly speaking, this introduces the tension between nature and culture and takes the side of a very maybe not necessarily simplified, but like very straightforward understanding of the term natural, right? Human nature is about what is natural, and what is natural is what is biological, and what is biological is something that is susceptible to evolutionary change. And we will talk about what the trait cluster count means next time. We now want to talk about the problems with these approaches, the trait reading accounts. But before we start doing that, Trent, do you have anything to add here?
Yes, I think one kind of specific image that really helps me to understand or conceptualize in a simpler way the difference between being and a cluster. As a cluster, let's talk about their commonality. For both accounts, in Graham Ramsey's understanding, traits are given. They're like solid items, basically. But the big thing differs from cluster in that it has a very clear and the predetermined or fixed boundary. There is the interior and there's the exterior. A trait, a ball, let's think it is the ball, could be placed inside or outside of the spin. Like having wings, be able to fly. Human beings are not able to do that. So it's outside the box. Like having a pair of lungs to be able to breathe air and exchange the oxygen to whatever, carbon dioxide, whatever, It's inside. But for like the cluster account, there isn't such a like bin that demarcates the border. So Grant Ramsey would provide a different way to construct the interior and exterior, but it's very different from the Bing account in the sense that there isn't such a borderline. What is it's more like international trade to an extent. The border is the natural separation between a smooth economic transaction within and without, but there isn't necessarily a borderline that set the two apart. So that's the image I had in mind, which helps me to understand the key differences between these two accounts.
I think that's a good image, and I think that's very much what is happening here. I also I think it's important to, as you reiterated, that the trait part is fixed. It's about how traits come together, right? How boundaries between a bunch of traits it's just calculated, and also it's important to just see that when we think about clusters to me, another image that comes to my mind is that like they're kind of like woven together in a way that a bin is not like that necessarily, right? If we have a cluster of things, I think there is some sort of like a bond between them. There is a connection between them. But when I think about bin, random stuff could be just thrown at the bin. They don't need to. The relations doesn't seem to be the important part,
Mhm.
right? I think for clusters, the relations become very important.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the problem that Ramsey has with the statistical frequency of traits as a way to demarcate human nature um, is that frequency doesn't equal significance. It's a very, I think, broad way of talking about it. Um, if you're only thinking about statistical frequency, for instance, what are we going to do with menopause? Which is not a very frequent trait, right? Uh, but if it's about characterization of what it means to be a human being, we appear to be the sole terrestrial mammal exhibiting this trait. That seems to be important. That seems to be something that characterizes us in contrast with other entities. And there are other examples of like traits appearing in humanity only at certain points and not for everyone, but that has nothing to do with determining its significance for characterizing humanity. If the trait only exists in humanity, it doesn't matter how rare it appears in humanity. That is something important about humanity, right? Um, and what Ramsey has in mind here is that anything that any kind of approach that wants to think about a statistical frequency as a cutoff of like this being versus the other being, nature being versus non-nature being, is doomed to failure because, when I say like the traits that all human beings have, well, good luck. If you want to include all humanity, then you're going to miss out a lot of things, right? But then, well, how are you going to set this? 80%, 70%, 50%, 20%? Like that seems to Ramsey as a doomed strategy from the very beginning. And it doesn't seem to really have anything it seems arbitrary basically, right? And he thinks there's going to be a better way to understand human nature that has nothing to do with this idea of frequency. Frequency is not the concept that we're looking for. Trent?
Um, you have already mentioned it. Maybe I can just give a like a biology 101 example to
Yeah.
illustrate it. It's like being able to sexually reproduce is a very rare trait among female bees because it's centralized to the queen bee. Yet it's indispensable for the continuation of the colony, even though it's extremely low frequency. So for Ramsey would perhaps accept this as an example to demonstrate why statistic cutoff criterion suspect and this methodology is like doomed from the very beginning. Yes.
That's a very good point. Yes. And the evolutionary property of traits is an interesting problem that it's gonna kind of reappear in different ways. But it's interesting that like Ramsey has the position that he has here because it might not be very compatible in some other to some other things that he says. But the idea that Ramsey has here is that if you want to kind of go and say that, okay, like this trait is biological, this trait is here because it is a biological trait. And this other trait is here because it's a cultural trait. You're going to have a lot of problems. You're going to have important problems. And you will, for instance, miss out on very uh, seemingly important aspects of humanity by taking that route. Human language, right? Human language, of course, is contingent about certain, biological, you know, neuroscientific aspects of humanity, of course, is the brain, but is also very much culturally maintained. Like if you had a culture that like banned communication for whatever reason, then all of those like capacities in the brain would have been dormant. That would have been just unused. Now, what is human language? Part of human nature? Well, it seems like that it's gonna be very hard to come up with a conception of human nature that doesn't include some form of existence of language, a verbal communication. But human language is very much dependent on cultural aspects of humanity and not just the natural ones. And even like some, lactase persistence, like just like some allergy issues, have some reactions to certain, food. They're also all, not all, but a lot of them like culturally manufactured, culturally redirected. Um, To Ramsey, this kind of distinction between biology and culture, insofar as the development and maintenance of certain traits go, doesn't make much sense. Isolating evolutionary traits and call that natural is to misunderstand that all of those quote unquote evolutionary traits are happening within the bounds of history and as a result very much influenced by cultural tendencies of humanity. uh, Again, we can think about aspects of humanity that are more biological, maybe we can have that discussion, but to have a Puritan view of biological cutoff, that is not gonna withstand the scrutiny that Ramsey wants to pursue.
Yes, like you just said, I think Ramsey here is criticizing one of his colleagues who proposed the so-called the evolutionary approach towards the trade model that, as you mentioned, put up a very strict dichotomy between culture and the nature. And that scholar maintains evolution as a model, historical causal model applies only to the natural realm. Culture changes or whatever, but it doesn't follow the same law. So we just don't think about it because they come and go. When I was reading, I was thinking of like Karl Marx. It's like we're studying the infrastructure here. We don't deal with the superstructure. Culture superstructure away. Let's see, because the human nature, of course, by using the term nature, we're already assuming we're concerning this infrastructure, aren't we? So let's look at that. And I think Graham Renzi is commendable here in alerting that camp of scholars say, no, 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 wait a second. Behavioral patterns we can observe about human individuals like we dance, for instance, it's important because not all animals dance, and therefore we should include that into our consideration of the cluster of human traits. So, as it is to a certain extent similar to the statistical cutoff, it's impossible that as we will discuss in his criticism of Corvinier, um, approach is like how at the end of the day, how do you decide what is natural, what is cultural? Is something like 1% natural or 100% natural? Because and he gives, I think, a very helpful example as a lactose persistence or tolerance in human groups. You can see like in certain cultural areas, say Southeast Asia, in the jungle area, most individuals there are not able to digest like non-fermented milk because they lack the necessary I don't know, infrastructure to digest it. Whereas where you're from, basically, it's they probably didn't make it if they couldn't digest milk like 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. That's an exaggeration. So, and that he uses this lactose persistence or tolerance as an example of that uh, cultural preferences or like exposure to certain things really has a enduring impact on the human physiological traits. So the perceived or assumed rigid boundary between nature and culture is not plausible. Hence, the criticism of the evolutionary property camp that we cannot just fix on the infrastructure without consideration of the superstructure. Instead, his cluster theory, he suggests that it has the merit of including both. So on that note, will you take us there?
Yes, I think one final note that I want to make, I think it's very important to make that parallel that you made, that kind of a Marxist analysis of humanity in
Mm.
terms of like there is this kind of a very clear distinction about infrastructure and superstructure, and I think that's exactly what Ramsey is criticizing. Now, what we wonder is whether he doesn't fall into the same hole, intellectual hole. And to hear that answer, you need to wait. Wait for the next episode and the episode after that. So, with that, we are gonna wrap up this episode.
Mhm.
We are gonna see you guys very soon.
So, guys, for instance, stay tuned. We're still on Graham Ramsey, and the next episode, we're gonna talk about his cluster theory of human traits.